It feels like, every time you open the news, you're hit with another story about some attack, some incident on a farm, right here in the UK.
Hmm.
It's getting kind of hard to ignore, and frankly, it makes you wonder about where our food is even coming from and if
That,
it's really safe.
yeah, there's definitely a growing sense of unease around it all.
And it kind of makes what we're digging into today all the more urgent, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
So this piece in Derbyshire Farmers from March 31st, 2025, their headline really grabbed me. England's urban farms vanishing at an alarming rate, Charity warns.
Vanishing at an alarming rate, that's not exactly subtle, is it?
No, not at all. And thankfully, it's not just like a feeling. There's real data backing this up. We've got this new report just out in February called Farming on the Edge, Urban Fringe Farming Report.
Right, from the CPRE, the Countryside Charity, you can see their logo right here.
Yeah, and this report, well, it dives deep into what's happening and why it matters, for all of us.
For sure.
Okay, so when we say urban farms, you might picture like a community garden tucked away somewhere, or maybe even those rooftop farms you sometimes see. But this isn't about those, is it?
Not quite.
This is about proper working farms, like the kind with tractors and fields and all, but they happen to be right on the edge of our towns and cities.
Right on the edge.
So in this deep dive, I guess what we're trying to do is figure out, well, why does it even matter that these farms are disappearing?
Exactly. What's the big deal here? The CPRE report, it really gets into the nitty-gritty of why these urban fringe farms are so crucial, especially when we think about how the UK feeds itself, now and in the future.
And for you, the learner, don't worry. We're not going to bury you in stats and jargon. We've waded through all the data, and what we're sharing here are the key insights, the stuff that really makes you go, oh, I get it now.
Yeah, no need for a headache from all the numbers.
So first things first, when they talk about urban fringe in the report, what does that even mean?
It's more specific than just, next to a city. So how do they actually define it?
Okay, so they split it into two types of areas. One is the green belt.
Okay.
Or that protected ring of land around lots of our big cities, like a buffer zone to stop urban sprawl. Think London, Birmingham, and the West Midlands, Greater Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, places like that.
Familiar concept. And the second type of area?
They call them comparator areas. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's land within 5 kilometers of the edges of any large city, one with over 100,000 people, but that doesn't have a green belt. So places like Leicester, Hull, Norwich, Swindon, Plymouth, you get the idea.
Interesting.
And get this, when you combine the green belt and those comparator areas, you're talking about a huge chunk of England, like 22% of the whole country.
That's a sizable area, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting here is the picture people might have in their head when they hear urban fringe.
Mm-hmm.
They might imagine just empty fields waiting for houses or shopping centers. But the report, it directly tackles that assumption, doesn't it?
Big time. They really get into how green this land is and how much of it is actually being used.
Yeah, what's it actually like out there?
Okay, so the surprising part. This urban fringe land, it's just as actively farmed as any other part of the country. And when you look at woodlands and open water, all those natural and semi-natural landscapes, it's either as green or even greener than the rest of England on average.
Wow.
They actually say the urban fringe has a third of all England's broad-leaved and mixed woodland, over a third of its standing open water, nearly a quarter of all the conifer woodland. So yeah, this is not just vacant land sitting around.
It's working land. A lot of it is being farmed, and that brings us to a really crucial point the report makes, which is the sheer productivity of these urban fringe farms.
Right, right.
They're not just like little hobby farms for people with a bit of land on the edge of town.
Nope, not at all. That Derbyshire Farmers article, they call them powerhouses of production, which I think is a great way to put it.
It is. And the data in the CPRU report backs that up.
Totally. So these farms, they make up only about 11.3% of the UK's total agricultural land, but they really punch above their weight when it comes to our food supply. Like, their contribution is huge.
Okay, give us some concrete numbers here. What are they actually doing to keep the nation fed?
All right. So in 2021, according to the CPRE, these farms, they produced enough food to feed over 7.2 million people for like over 61% of their total food needs.
Wow.
Or, to put it another way, they provided 74% of all the food that we eat in the UK that could be grown or raised here.
That's a massive contribution from a relatively small area, isn't it? Makes you realize that when these farms disappear, it's not just about the landscape changing, it's about potentially losing a big chunk of our food supply.
Exactly.
So they're crucial. And when we look at the specifics of what they're producing, it gets even more interesting, doesn't it?
It does. So let's break it down. In 2021, for all the cereals we consume in the UK, so that's wheat, barley, oats, over 20% of that came from these urban fringe farms. And for other key foods, like pig meat, poultry, mutton and lamb, eggs, beef, fresh veggies, milk, potatoes, even sugar beet, they contributed between 9 and 15% of the UK's new food supply.
I noticed fresh fruit was a bit lower in the report, though.
Yeah, fresh fruit was a bit of an outlier at about 3.4%, but the report explains that's mostly because we rely so much on imported fruit anyway.
That makes sense. So for all the staples, they're really pulling their weight.
Big time.
And economically, what's the impact of all this? Like, how much is all this food production actually worth?
Well, back in 2021, the food from these farms, it brought in over 3.3 billion pounds. And if you adjust that for inflation, we're talking about nearly 4 billion pounds in 2023 prices.
So a significant economic engine as well.
Yep.
And the report also really highlights something else crucial, the quality of the land in these areas.
Yeah, the soil.
Right, the soil. There's a good point of emphasizing that.
They do, and for good reason. So a big chunk of this urban fringe land, it's actually top quality agricultural land. 19% of it is grade 1, which is like the gold standard for growing crops, and another 23% is grade 2.
Yeah.
That's really important, especially when you compare it to the rest of the UK, where a lot of the land is, more suited to grassland and livestock. In fact, even though the urban fringe is only about 11% of the UK's total farmland, it makes up almost 18% of all our cropland.
So incredibly valuable land in terms of our ability to grow food. But we've got these headlines, like the one from Derbyshire farmers, talking about a rapid decline. Like,
Right.
What are the actual numbers behind this alarming rate of loss? What does it really look like?
Yeah, so Derbyshire farmers, they laid it out pretty starkly. Over 1,700 urban edge farms gone since 2010, totaling a whopping 56,000 hectares. That's like the size of Leeds.
And the CPRE report, it actually breaks down the numbers even further, right?
It does. They dug into the government's own data, and they found that between 2010 and 2021, the total farmed area in the urban fringe, it shrunk by 3%. Which, 3% might not sound like much, but here's the thing. During that same time, the total farmed area nationally actually went up by 1%. So we're losing ground where we really can't afford to. And over 80% of this urban fringe loss, a massive 45,000 hectares, happened within the Greenbelt.
That's concerning. And it's not just the amount of land disappearing, is it? The number of farms themselves is going down, too.
Exactly. So the CPRE found that between 2010 and 2021, the number of farms in the urban fringe, it dropped by almost 6.6%. And again, that's way worse than the national picture, which only saw a tiny decline of 0.2%. And just like with the land, most of those farm losses were in the Greenbelt.
Okay, so fewer farms, less farmland. But the report also looks at how the nature of these farms is changing, doesn't it? Like the sizes of the farms and the kinds of things they're growing and raising.
They do. It's not just about numbers. It's about what's happening on the ground. So they saw this trend of more and more very small farms popping up, ones under 5 hectares, which honestly seems to be happening nationwide. But the real worry is the drop in small to medium-sized farms, the kind that often have the most diverse output.
Why is that decline particularly worrying?
Well, think about it. Those are the farms that really contribute to having a wider range of food available. And the CPRE report highlights some pretty drastic declines in certain types of farming in the urban fringe, much worse than we're seeing nationally. Dairy farms, they went down by a huge 33.6%.
That's a lot.
And specialist horticulture, the folks growing our fruits and veggies, they saw a 26.8% drop. Interestingly, they also found fewer specialist pig farms in the urban fringe, even though pig farming is actually increasing nationally.
Huh. That is interesting. So big losses in sectors that are really important for our food security and just having a variety of food to eat.
Right.
What else did they find about these shifts in farming types?
They noticed this rise in farms classified as other non-classifiable, which could mean some of that land is being used for things other than food production, maybe leisure or some kind of businesses. And this decline in those horticultural businesses, the fruit and veg growers, it might actually be linked to the fact that the UK's vegetable production has fallen a lot since 2011.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The report says open field vegetable production is down 16.5%, and protected production, like in greenhouses, it's down a massive 33.3% between 2011 and 2023.
So maybe part of the reason we're seeing less homegrown veg on our plates is because those farms on the urban fringe are disappearing.
Could be.
It sounds like these trends we're seeing now, they kind of echo what was happening in the past, too. The report mentions a study from 2006, doesn't it?
They do. That study, back then, they were already seeing this decline in urban fringe farming. They put it down to things like the financial help available to different types of farms, the decline in traditional market gardening, and the impact of infrastructure development. They also pointed out that a lot of farms in these peri-urban areas, they needed income from non-farming activities just to survive, and it seems like that's still true today.
So, yeah, not a new problem. But the picture now is pretty clear. These urban fringe farms, they're incredibly important, but they're under a lot of pressure, and they are disappearing.
Which brings us to, well, what can we do about it? The CPRE report doesn't just lay out the problem, it offers some suggestions, some potential solutions.
Right. They actually have a whole list of recommendations aimed at the government.
Yeah, they're not just sitting back and watching this happen.
And Graeme Willis, he's CPRE's agricultural lead. He's quoted in that Derbyshire Farmers article saying something that really stuck with me. Every hectare of farmland lost is more than a statistic. It's an irreversible erosion of our countryside and a direct threat to national resilience. Powerful words.
Yeah. So the CPRE, one of their big things is to speed up the introduction of the land use framework, the LUF, with policies that really look at land use strategically, from a national perspective, with food security in mind.
Okay.
They say we need to prioritize those urban fringe areas for nature and sustainable land management, update the agricultural land classification system to reflect the true value of this land, strengthen protections for the highest quality farmland, and encourage landscape enhancement in these areas.
So big picture stuff about how we plan and manage land use. What about actual support for the farmers themselves, the ones trying to make a living in these urban fringe areas?
They've got ideas for that too. They stress the importance of having support packages that work for small farms, like market gardens, so they can participate too.
Makes sense, making sure the help actually fits the farms it's supposed to help.
Exactly.
What else is on their list?
They also want to see changes in national planning policies and guidance, the rules around development, to actually protect and encourage sustainable farming in the greenbelt and all those urban fringe areas.
Yeah.
They say this would give farmland better protection from development pressures.
Okay.
And they want the government to go further with those annual June farming surveys. They want them to specifically analyze trends in the urban fringe and try to understand what's driving farmers' decisions in those areas.
Interesting. So not just collecting data, but really digging into it to understand what's going on.
Right. And lastly, they highlight how important it is to encourage sustainable small-scale agriculture and strong local food markets.
So it's like a whole system, right? It's not just about protecting land. It's about supporting the right kind of farming and making sure there are markets for those products.
Exactly. It's all connected. And I think the main takeaway here is that these urban fringe farms, they're not just some forgotten bit of countryside.
Right.
They're a vital part of our food system, and they're vanishing fast.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the message is pretty clear. Losing these urban fringe farms, it has huge implications for how the UK feeds itself and for the environment as a whole.
Yeah.
It's not just about farmland disappearing, it's about our national resilience being threatened, like Graeme Willis said.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think, with all the pressure on land and the growing need for local and resilient food systems, what can we do to turn this around? What are the solutions that can actually reverse this loss of urban farms and make sure we all have access to good food in the future? It really highlights how intertwined everything is. Urban development, food production, the environment. It's a lot to think about.
It is.
And it's something we all need to be a part of figuring out.